Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I have the one and only, the legendary David Buss. David is a psychologist. He's an evolutionary psychologist and one of the founders of the field of evolutionary psychology. He's written numerous books. Some of the most commonly cited ones are The Evolution of Desire, Strategies of Human Mating, and textbooks such as Evolutionary Psychology, The New Science of the Mind. And in this episode, we talk about his new book, When Men Behave Badly, The Hidden Roots of Sexual Deception, Harassment, and Assault, which is out tomorrow. So I highly encourage everyone to go and purchase that book. In this episode, we talk about the book, but first we talk about his background and how he helped to develop evolutionary psychology as its own field and why it's important. He gives a wonderful, broad discussion of sexual selection, sexual differences, and different mating strategies. We talk about his new book, When Men Behave Badly, and why there is mating conflict. We talk about how men are responsible for the darker behaviors and how they're commonly seen as perpetrators of sexual violence towards women. We talk about the distinction between, are all men capable of these horrible acts, or is it some individual differences with a select few, and can we see what those personality differences may be? We talk about the dark triad of personality and how that contributes to some of the men who commit sexually violent crimes. We talk about the dark aspect of human nature overall, and not simply relying on folks being socialized or just the environment as a variable for these things, or misaligning them as that. And so we talk about really a multivariate way of understanding why really horrible things can happen and how we can really mistreat each other, and how this shapes out in various aspects all around the world. We end the conversation by talking about the application of evolutionary psychology and why that's important. I have to say, this was quite an honor to be talking to David. I remember reading his stuff in grad school, and in textbooks, and he's definitely a giant in the field of psychology, and obviously within evolutionary psychology. And many of his students have now gone on to be scholars in their own right and well published as well. So it really was a big treat to have him on and talk about work he's been doing for 30 plus years, and to really talk about his new book, which sounds absolutely fantastic. And as you'll see in the conversation, he has a really big passion for understanding these things that happen, and how we can understand them appropriately, and then try to see how we can prevent them from happening going forward. So now I bring you David Buss. I'm here with the one and only legendary David Buss. David, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's a big honor. I really greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be chatting with you. It'll be fun.
Yeah, no, of course. Okay, so I reached out to you, and I know you have a new book coming out, so I definitely want to talk about that. But for those of you that don't know you, just kind of tell us who you are.
Okay, well, my name's David Buss. As you mentioned, I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Texas. Previously taught at University of California, Berkeley, which is where I got my PhD. Harvard University as an assistant professor, University of Michigan for 11 years, and now University of Texas. So I'm an evolutionary psychologist, and my main area of specialty is strategies of human mating, the evolved psychology of human mating, which I think is, I don't know how I stumbled into this or lucked into this, but it's turned out to be a very fruitful, rich vein of scientific inquiry. So I feel very, very lucky and blessed. I mean, you imagine how many people become scientists, and let's say you're, I don't know, maybe this is unfair, but let's say a chemist working in a field where most of the things have already been discovered. Well, in the case of evolutionary psychology and human mating strategies, very little. I mean, now we know a fair amount, but when I first got into it, we knew the field as a science knew practically nothing. And so there was a lot of gold to be mined there, and it continues to yield gold. Yeah. So like every time I think, well, maybe I should stop studying mating and study something different, like murder, which I've done. It turns out most of the motives for murder are ultimately related to mating in one way or another. And so I've become like one of those weird guys where, you give someone a hammer and the world seems full of nails. And I feel that way about mating. It just is related to everything. Yeah. And I could be delusional or I could be right.
Yeah. Well, that's a great introduction. I know you as one of the founders of evolutionary psychology. So, I mean, again, I'm really happy to talk to you. I mean, just, obviously don't have to give us a whole long history, but, how did that start? I mean, you wrote one of the major first textbooks on evolutionary psychology. I mean, you have plenty of students that have now gone on and done great work on their own. So, I mean, you're kind of what you were saying there in terms of understanding human mating, we didn't know that for a long time in the world of psychology, or at least not how we do now. And how did you just kind of stumble into branching off this new field or subdiscipline within psychology of what we have as evolutionary psychology now?
Yeah, great question. In a nutshell, what I was interested in, what I became interested in as an undergraduate was human nature. I was interested in, what is the nature of human nature? And as a consequence, I went into the field of, there was no evolutionary psychology at the time. So I went to graduate school in personality psychology, in part because I viewed personality psychology as that sub-branch that dealt with the big theories of human nature. And the more I got into it, and this happened very quickly in my first year of graduate school, you go through all the grand theories of human nature, Freud, Adler, Jung, Rogers, etc. And all of them struck me as having some elements that had intuitive appeal, but they lacked a solid conceptual or a solid scientific foundation on which you could build a theory of human nature. And so it was that kind of drew me to evolutionary theory in general. And at the time, the first book I read in evolutionary anything was a book by Lionel Tiger and Robin Fox called The Imperial Animal in 1971. And it kind of opened my eyes a little bit to the notion that, and they were talking mostly about primates, but brought in humans as well. And so when you talk about identifying a scientific foundation for a theory of human nature, you're ultimately drawn, or I was drawn to evolutionary theory, because evolutionary theory identifies the causal processes that are responsible for creating whatever mechanisms of mind that we have, mechanisms of mind housed in the brain and housed in the body. And so for the first time, so I kind of gravitated toward that, and so started doing those explorations post-PhD. So post-PhD, I was very fortunate to get a job at Harvard as an assistant professor in personality psychology. Again, there was no such thing as evolutionary psychology. Right. But I decided I took over this course on human motivation that was being taught or had been taught historically by David McClelland, who was a very famous personality psychologist. And so I decided, he didn't have any instructions for how to teach the course. So I thought, I'll frame the course around evolutionary theory. So I framed the course around evolutionary theory as a kind of overarching thing, while in the process doing a lot of deep dive reading in evolutionary theory because I didn't have any training in it. But that teaching of that course led to meeting Leda Cosmides, who's one of the founders of evolutionary psychology. So she came and knocked on, she was a graduate student at Harvard at the time with her husband, John Tooby. She was in psychology, he was in bioanthro. And she knocked on my door and she said, I hear you're teaching a course that's oriented around evolutionary theory. And I said, yeah. And well, they hadn't published anything at that point. But of course, they went on to become, really, I think, the true conceptual founders of the field of evolutionary psychology in terms of integrating deep evolutionary theory with cognitive science or in the information processing approach to human beings. So anyways, it was kind of like one thing led to another, and I started corresponding with people like Don Simons, and I started reading, Robert Trivers. I found his work in a used bookstore. It was a book, and so you kind of, and then I was at Harvard. E.O. Wilson was there at the time, so I went and chatted with him. He was very kind to me, and actually I have an inscribed book by him, not his sociobiology book, but a book that he wrote on the insects. I just found it in my bookshelf the other day, and I was kind of just tickled that I had this book from way back when.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's a long-winded answer to your question.
No, it's great. And I guess people kind of see that there was an established branch, I think, of ethology, and then evolutionary psychology kind of came out of this, right? Or kind of adjacent to it. If ethology is looking at animals and how animals behave, but then, evolutionary psychology is how do we understand the natural world and how do we understand other animals? And then how does that correspond with humans? But how would you, maybe that's a wrong definition, but how do you understand the two disciplines and how you come to define and describe it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I see ethology as part of a long tradition, really going back to Darwin. So I view Darwin as the first evolutionary psychologist because at the end of On Origin of Species, he didn't talk much about humans in that book, but we're talking 1859. He said, in the distant future, psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the gradual. He described the evolutionary process. And it was really like what I call Darwin's prophecy. He was saying in 1859, in the distant future, psychology will be based on a new foundation. And it took many, many, many years, over a century, for that to actually happen. And so I think that there were and then of course Darwin's 1871 book on sexual selection and the descent of man was dealt focally with humans. And so I think Darwin is the first evolutionary psychologist, and then you had different movements. I think that the field of psychology took a backwards turn in its embrace of behaviorism, which was kind of very much a blank slate view, what Pinker would call a blank slate view of the human mind. And it didn't even matter, sort of the principles of operant conditioning were presumed to be so general in nature that you could study pigeons or rats. It didn't really matter. Right. But of course it does matter from an evolutionary perspective. Each species has its own unique adaptations. Of course, some are shared and some are derived from ancestral forms. So the field of psychology took a bad turn there, even though there were people like William James, who published in 1890, who was really kind of moving in the right direction, but the field didn't embrace him. They named the Harvard Psychology Building after him, but didn't embrace him conceptually as a field. And then you have different movements, and you have ethology, and then you have sociobiology. But what I think what evolutionary psychology did is it really brought the psychological level of description, psychological adaptations as front and center of what we have to focus on and explain. That is, what are the evolved information processing programs that humans have evolved? What is their design? What adaptive problems do they solve? Have they evolved to solve? And it's sort of that agenda that, whereas ethology didn't have that. It looked more at fixed action patterns and made important discoveries, but didn't have that focus on psychological mechanisms.
Yeah, no, that's great. And so in your work, I mean, you have written plenty of books. You've written one, or is it just one textbook, Evolutionary Psychology, or have you written a few textbooks? I can't recall.
I actually have two. Yeah, so
two.
The Evolutionary Psychology as you point out, is the first textbook in the field. And I also have a personality psychology text. So I've sort of maintained, half a foot in that camp. And I think that's been good, actually, because one of the things that the earlier instantiations of evolutionary psychology tended to ignore individual differences. And the field of personality is centrally concerned with individual differences. So I think that my training in personality psychology has served me well in that I've always viewed individual differences as really important, and they have to be integrated with the theory of human nature.
Yeah. Well, that's a good segue into maybe kind of give us, because this will launch us into your new book that's coming out, but launch us into kind of just a broad overview of some of the sex differences between men and women, and how that looks like in terms of mating, mate retention, certain types of signaling, etc. Just give us a broad. I mean, it's a very, very big topic, right? Obviously, you've written books on it, but just kind of give us, kind of the broad overview or thumbnail sketch of some of this stuff.
Sure. Well, that's interesting that you start off with that, because the topic of sex differences is very controversial these days, kind of oddly so in my view. But basically, sexual reproduction evolved. I mean, the estimates vary, but let's say ballpark would be 1.3 billion years ago. And so it's a very ancient, we evolved from asexually reproducing species. So once you have sexual reproduction, basically you have two sexes, male and female, and they're defined, some people are defined by, well, you pull down the person's pants and look at their genitals. No, that's not how sex differences are defined. They're defined by the size of the gametes, the size of the sex cells. So in the human case, we have sperm and egg, and males are defined as the ones with the small sex cells, the sperm, and the females are defined as the ones with the large nutrient-rich sex cells. And that's how biological sex is defined. And once you have the evolution of that split, a kind of not exactly division of labor, but a specialization, where the sperm are basically small packets of DNA with an outboard motor attached, or they're designed for swimming speed to get to that nutrient-rich egg, which is very, very large and a very valuable contribution. And so from the moment of conception, you have this asymmetry in investment. And this was the key to, and so once you get specialization by sex, you get other asymmetries of investment occurring. So if you talk about human reproductive biology, and Trivers really was the first one who nailed it with his major elaboration of Darwin's theory of sexual selection. So maybe I shouldn't just mention sexual selection and then turn to Trivers. So sexual selection, this is Darwin, 1871. Darwin was very perplexed by phenomena that he observed that could not be explained by what he then called natural selection or survival selection. So the stereotype of the brilliant plumage of peacocks, brilliant colors of birds, bird song, these elaborate things that seem to have nothing at all to do with survival, and in some cases were bad for survival, like the brilliant plumage that attracts predators. Sure. And so it troubled him deeply, and also he was puzzled by sex differences. So in other words, both sexes have faced the same survival problems. Both sexes have to eat. In warm-blooded species, they have to thermoregulate, they have to fend off predators, parasites. Why would the sexes differ at all in size and morphology or behavior? And moreover, why would different species vary in the magnitude of sexual dimorphism? And so in response to puzzles of this sort, Darwin came up with what I think is really his most brilliant theory, is the theory of sexual selection, which deals with the evolution of characteristics because of the mating or reproductive advantage rather than the survival advantage. And the two component processes of sexual selection by which reproductive advantage is attained, of course, you have to survive to reproductive age, but one is same-sex competition, where the stereotype is two stags locking horns in combat, and the victor gains sexual access to the female, and loser ambles off with a broken antler and low self-esteem and needing a psychotherapist. And the logic is that whatever qualities lead to success in these same-sex battles, those qualities get passed on in greater numbers by virtue of the sexual access that the victors gain. Qualities associated with losing basically bite the evolutionary dust from an evolutionary perspective. And the second component, so that's one, the other is preferential mate choice. And the logic there is very simple but very powerful, is that if members of one sex, and Darwin focused on females, if females agree with one another about the qualities that are desired in the opposite sex, then those who possess the desired qualities have a mating advantage. They get preferentially chosen. Those who lack desired qualities get shunned, banished, and they become what we now would call incels, or involuntarily celibate males. And it's due to this process of female, what Darwin called female choice. And so again, you see evolution, which is change over time, an increase in the frequency of desired qualities, if those desired qualities have some heritable basis. And so basically, the theory of sexual selection is the theory that is the broad overarching theoretical framework for understanding the mating strategies of all sexually reproducing species. And what Trivers added 101 years later with his theory of parental investment was he asked the question, well, which sex does the competing, which sex does the choosing? And his answer was the sex that does the heavy investing is more choosy because the costs of making a bad mating decision are much steeper for the heavy investing sex. You can imagine, I don't know, if you're in the modern environment, if you're going out to buy a candy bar, it's not a heavy investment, so you probably won't spend years deliberating over which candy bar you buy. But if you're going to buy a car or a house, you spend a lot of time because it's a heavy investment. So because the benefits of making a good choice are high with a heavy investment, the costs of making a bad mate choice are high if you're making a heavy investment. And conversely, if you're not making much investment, the benefit, the costs of making a bad mating decision are low. And so that was Trivers' answer. And the sex that invests less is more competitive with members of their own sex for access to that very valuable high investing sex, which in this case is women. Now, with humans, it gets complicated because in long-term mating, which we have as one of our strategies, both sexes do heavy investing. And so both sexes, according to Trivers' theory, we expect to be very choosy, and they are. It's when you get to short-term mating, low-cost, low-investment sex that you find large sex differences emerging. So back to your original question. So this is a theoretical background for understanding at least some of the sex differences. What we expect is that in short-term mating, that men will have stronger motivations for short-term mating, that men will have adaptations to try to acquire short-term mates, including attracting them, having sex with them, and also jettisoning or ejecting them to avoid the entangling commitments of a long-term mate. And so things like the male sexual overperception bias, woman smiles at a man or incidentally touches his arm, men think, oh, well, she's interested. And, women think, oh, well, actually, I was just being polite or friendly. I'm not actually very interested. So there are sort of sex differences when it comes to short-term mating. And then, so some on the male side and then some on the female side to guard against deception by men who are deceiving them in order to pursue a short-term mating. And one of the ways in which men do this is they feign interest in a long-term mating strategy, even if they're trying to carry out a short-term mating strategy. And so women have adaptations to defend against that. But also the benefits to women of short-term mating, they don't occur in the historical currency of increase in reproductive success, but they can occur in currencies like obtaining access to better genes, from a short-term mate, or what I think is the most viable hypothesis is the mate switching hypothesis. That is, we women and men get involved in long-term relationships where it turns out it fizzles out, or it turns out to be cost-inflicting, or it turns out you can trade up to a better mate. And so women have mate switching adaptations, and so sometimes engage in short-term mating for the function of mate switching. So those are a couple of differences when it comes to short-term mating. Then when it comes to long-term mating, there are some key differences. So both sexes are very choosy. Both sexes are very competitive because men as well as women want to attract a highly desirable, a high mate value long-term mate. And so that takes, high long-term mates by definition tend to be choosier than lower mate value mates. And so, the issue is how can you succeed in attracting a very desirable long-term mate? And men and women are more similar in that respect in what they want. So both sexes want long-term mates who are intelligent, kind, healthy, dependable, things like that. But they do differ in some respects. So they differ in that women place a greater priority on resources, on a guy's financial prospects, his job prospects, his social status, and the qualities that lead to resources over time, such does the guy have goals? Does he have drive? Is he ambitious? Yeah. Is he going places? Is he well respected by others? And so there's like a ability to accrue resources, and then also willingness to channel those resources to the particular woman who's doing the mate selecting. And those can be different things. A man might be wealthy, but be unwilling to channel them toward a particular woman. So women look for cues to commitment. Is he willing, not just able, to accrue resources? And women go for somewhat older age in long-term mates. They prefer guys who are 2, 3, 4, 5 years older than they are for a variety of reasons. One is that a bit older age is linked with greater social status and resources. It's also linked with more emotional maturity and some of the things that make for a good long-term mateship. Men, and some people get upset about this, but it's just a fact, wasn't known prior to my 37 culture study, but men worldwide place a greater priority on physical appearance, good looks, physical attractiveness, however it's worded, and also relative youth. That is, women who are typically younger than they are. And these are basically boiled down to cues to health and cues to youth. And so those are some of the broad brushstroke sex differences.
Yeah, no, that's all fantastic. And again, it's really interesting how, over, 30, 40, 50 years now, we understand a lot of these things about, how men and women, how they mate, how they select, how they have certain preferences. Is this, and I think one of the powerful things about evolution as a fact, and then as a theory, and then is that when you have these things rooted in evolution, these things make sense because it's not just for humans necessarily, right? There are some of these things that can occur with where we as, Homo sapiens, we sit in the animal kingdom, right? As another, primate. But is there a reason why, or, I know why start to get really fuzzy, but is there any indicators of, how this came about, or how some of these, differences, or how it's a little bit more complicated for humans than, say, chimps or bonobos or even other animals? Is there certain things that are very specific to humans, and maybe ideas about why that may be?
Yeah, and there are, and this gets into somewhat speculative territory, but informs speculation. So one of the things that you have with humans, in contrast to chimpanzees, who are our closest primate relative, is you have one is heavy male parental investment. So chimp males, they inseminate the female and do nothing. They don't do anything for the the little chimplets. But we do. Males, fortunately, typically do more than the minimum, and we are a heavy male parental investment species. So the men do provide for their kids sometimes, not always. They protect their kids. So there's, and this can last 20 years or more. Well, actually, with boomerang kids, it can last even more than 20 years. So that's one kind of unique feature of our species compared to chimpanzees. Another is relatively concealed ovulation. So with chimps, when the female ovulates, she goes into this estrus period with bright red genital swellings and olfactory cues, and the males can pick it up from a football field away, and they kind of go into a sexual frenzy. And so they basically never they don't have to, another way of putting that is that in our species, males never know when women are ovulating. I once had a graduate student who claimed he could walk into a bar and detect which women were ovulating, but he turned out to be, let's put it this way, falsify many of his claims. Many of his claims turned out to be false, and we ended up kicking him out.
It's quite the claim.
Yeah, it is quite the claim. It is. I think that there's enough evidence that there might be subtle changes that do occur with ovulation, that if you are living with a woman or seeing her on a regular basis, you might be able to detect them. But the notion that you could just walk into a crowded bar and know which women are ovulating is preposterous. There's zero evidence for that.
Yeah.
But so when you have concealed ovulation, I think this co-evolved with heavy male parental investment. You have a profound adaptive problem that the chimp males don't have, and that's you have to mate with a woman in order to successfully reproduce. But if you don't know when she's ovulating, how do you do it? And I think this is one of the things that resulted or co-evolved with a shift toward prioritizing physical appearance and physical attractiveness, because physical attractiveness and physical appearance and youth, these provide a wealth of cues to fertility that the woman is fertile or of fertile age or of fertile status. Not ovulating at that moment. But then you get to the third component, which is long-term mating. So you have heavy male parental investment, concealed ovulation, and then long-term mating, which also chimps don't have. And in long-term mating, you have the guy, so probability of conceiving per act of sex with a non-contracepting couple is about 3.5%. So it's actually pretty low.
Wow.
But if you're having sex repeatedly with the same woman, over, weeks, months, possibly years, then there's a much higher probability that she's going to get successfully fertilized. So, and so you have long-term mating where guys are now sticking around. They're investing in the woman. They're having sex with her throughout the ovulation cycle because they never know. And so I think these three things are some of the things that really distinguish humans from other species. So like even just take like the age thing, that in our species, men tend to prefer younger women as sex partners and as long-term mates. Chimps don't. So in chimps, they actually prefer slightly older females, because it turns out in chimps, the older females are more fertile. So here's another way of phrasing that. In long-term mating, men don't think like this, but the adaptive problem that selection has favored male solving is monopolizing a woman's entire reproductive value. So not just sex right now, but monopolizing her entire reproductive value. And so if a male mates with a woman who's younger, then he has a higher chance of monopolizing that reproductive value. So whereas again with chimps, they know when the female's fertile, they have sex pretty much exclusively when she's giving off those I'm ovulating signs. Problem solved. Males have a little bit more difficult challenge on that front.
Wow. Yeah. I've never really heard it kind of spelled out that way. And that's absolutely fascinating. I appreciate that. That's very helpful to, I guess, to understand using chimps as a comparison point. Of course, we could be here all day talking about the various animals in the animal kingdom and how they mate, but that's particularly instructive. So I want to give time for your new book, which is coming out. Maybe just give us the elevator pitch. You know, what's the main thesis? Why did you decide to write it? Let me see if I get this right. So it's the title is "When Men Behave Badly: The Hidden Roots of Sexual Deception, Harassment, and Assault." Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah.
When Men Behave Badly is the title, and the subtitle deals with sexual deception, harassment, and assault. And maybe we should start there and maybe say a few words about the title.
Sure.
So the topic of so the book is about conflict between the sexes, male-female conflict, and it's a topic that has interested me for many, many years. I think I published my first scientific paper on it about 30 years ago, but it's a topic that kind of has obsessed me on and off for many years. And part of it is maybe due to the perverseness of my own personality, but I've always been fascinated by the darker sides of human nature. So that's why I've studied like murder, stalking, intimate partner violence, deception. For some reason, the darker sides of human nature fascinate me. But when I started out to write this book, I've always had it as a goal to write a book about conflict between the sexes. And when I started out, I thought that I would basically give kind of equal weight to the ways in which women torture men and the ways in which men torture women. Mm-hmm. And so that's the first few chapters of the book, and indeed do that. So men and women both deceive each other on the mating market, like on internet dating sites. It's very predictable the ways in which they do. But when you get into the more extreme forms of conflict, the ones that involve sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, murder, things like that, the more men tend to have a monopoly on it. So just as an example, to take murder, if an adult woman is murdered, the odds are between 50 and 70% that the murderer, the perpetrator of the murder, is a romantic partner or former romantic partner. So boyfriend, husband, or former boyfriend, former husband. If an adult man is murdered, the odds of it being at the hands of a romantic partner or former romantic partner are 3%. Whoa. So, wow. And of course, men do more killing than women worldwide, and do more mate killing, and also more killing of their intersexual rivals. That's partly why I mentioned earlier that you can run, but you can't get away from mating. It's related to everything. Yeah. So let's take another thing like stalking. So criminal stalking. Well, men don't have a total monopoly on it, but criminal stalking, about 80% of the perpetrators are men, and about 20% are women. And so as I wrote the book and got into some of the more extreme forms of sexual conflict, so sexual coercion, rape, sexual harassment, the more men tend to have a monopoly on it. And so the book shifted somewhat away from an equal treatment of the ways in which men and women torture each other to more of a focus on male perpetrators of sexual violence in various forms, and importantly, female defenses against them. And so I have chapter 8 in the book. I devote an entire, very long chapter to what I think is really the best synthesis of women's defenses against sexual violence. And I think it's actually possibly the most important chapter in the book. So that's why the title, the title, if I ended up writing a book that I initially envisioned that had just identical ways in which, or parallel ways in which men and women torture each other, it would have been called something like, The Battle of the Sexes, or Conflict Between the Sexes, or Sexual Conflict. But that's why it ended up being tilted heavily toward bad stuff men do in terms of sexual violence, and hence the title, When Men Behave Badly. And the other thing that is important about that title is the when men behave badly, because it's men don't behave badly. So it's not a book about slamming men. Not all men are rapists. There are huge individual differences. And as I go into in the book, it's a particular combination of some men under some conditions, under some social circumstances that engage in bad behavior. So that not all men do it, and even the men who do it don't do it all the time. And so what the book attempts to do is to identify, and this goes back to an earlier point that we were talking about, is individual differences. And in the book, I talk about the individual differences that are predictors of which men engage in these bad forms of sexual violence.
I'm curious about this. So, when we're talking about individual differences, and obviously you're talking about social, environmental context, is it, you tell me the accuracy of this claim, could we say that, I don't like absolutes, but could we say that all men have a propensity for that kind of violence? Or is it very clearly, it is highly unlikely that men with these features or with these differences are very unlikely to do these acts, and men with these features and context are more likely to do them? Or is it in general, look, that's human nature. Men, they're more aggressive, et cetera. Any male could have the potential to do this. What is the, I guess, more the correct version there, if there is one, and how do we know that?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And all I can give you is my current version of that. So I think that, the fact that if you look at, let's just take rape, for example, to take the most extreme form of it, there are, for all practical purposes, only men who do this, and so this is true, across cultures, across time, as far as we have written records, and also across time, as far as we have genetic records. So the field of molecular genetics has revealed some really fascinating portraits of where you have a population, and from a genetic perspective, it's clear that an invading population of males came in and basically displaced the males, which means killed them or drove them away. And then, and so you have shifts in the molecular genetic makeup of the population, where basically all the females are still there. All the mitochondrial DNA is still there, but all of a sudden there's a new set of Y chromosomes. And so this happened, with in the former Mongolian Empire, with Genghis Khan and his crew. It happened in Ireland. It happened in Scandinavia with Viking invasions, Ireland as well. So you have multiple sources of evidence kind of pointing to the fact that there have been these displacements. But I think the individual differences are absolutely critical. And the question you asked is a great one, because it's something that I've wrestled with. And in part, we don't know the complete answer, simply because we can't experimentally put men in the conditions under which we think that they would engage in this behavior. So what are those conditions? They would be conditions of like low or no cost. So it's the closest parallel, the closest situation would be a warfare context where your group defeated and killed all the other males in the group. And so the females have no bodyguards, no male bodyguards around, and are basically helpless. Would all men rape under those conditions? And I think that, I think the answer is probably not. Some men would, and we know what the personality characteristics and sexual strategies are of the subset of men who are most likely to do it.
That was my next question.
So what are they? So I go into this in some detail in the book, both on, and this applies to not just rape, but also to sexual harassment, and some of the other phenomena like intimate partner violence, is men who are high on the dark triad personality traits. So these are narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. So I'm sure many listeners will know what these are, but just very briefly, narcissism, one of the hallmarks of narcissism is grandiosity, a sense of entitlement, especially sexual entitlement, but also sort of social entitlement. They feel like they deserve more than anyone else because they're great, because of who they are. And so that's one of the hallmarks of narcissism. They think they're hot also, but they're not necessarily hot. Then you have Machiavellianism, which is people who pursue what I call an exploitative interpersonal strategy. So there's other people who are tools to be manipulated, coerced, pawns to be played in their exploitative game. And so they're very, very exploitative. And then psychopathy, one of the hallmarks of psychopathy is lack of empathy. So most people feel some empathy for other people if they're in pain, if they're suffering, or like a dog. If a dog gets hurt, people feel bad for the dog. Psychopaths don't. They actually enjoy torturing animals when they're young, and they don't care about the feelings or harms they inflict on other people. So men who are high in these dark triad traits, and men tend to be higher than women, by the way, especially on the psychopathy dimension. You combine that with a dispositional pursuit of a short-term mating strategy. That combination of personality and short-term mating is what leads to a much greater proclivity for sexual harassment and sexual coercion of various sorts. And so, getting back to your key question, in, let's say, sexual harassment and rape, it tends to be a subset of men who are serial harassers or serial rapists. So that is a small percentage of men actually commit the vast majority of acts of this. Now, of course, these things are distributed, so there are some men who would, let's say, pressure a woman into having sex or try to get her drunk. When I wrote my first book, by the way, The Evolution of Desire, I had this whole section on, I got to tell you the story, this whole section on, the importance of provisioning and meat, since we evolved as hunter-gatherers, and guy tracking women with meat. And I showed this draft to some graduate students. And one male graduate student wrote in the margins, he said, "David, meat is neat, but liquor is quicker." And so men do this, and alarmingly, one of the things I review, one of the studies in the book that found that when men are sexually aroused, they are more likely to say they would do things like encourage a woman to drink, or even slip her a date rape drug, or persist in sex even after she said no, if they're in that sexually aroused state. And so that's partly why I said earlier that we don't know the complete answer to your question, because ideally, from an experimental point of view, we'd want to put men in these actual situations and see how they behave. And it's unethical to do that.
Sure. Yeah. And I would just say one piece about the dark triad, as far as I know, is it's not, I think some people have this misconception that the dark triad of personality is inherently bad. And I think that what you're saying is that it's these elevated levels, or levels that are on these traits that are much higher, or used for exploitative or maladaptive intentions or behaviors, not necessarily that there could be some adaptive qualities in using some of those traits as well. Is that fair?
Yeah, yes, that is fair. And, and there's evidence for that. So among other things, women, especially younger women, find men high in these dark triad traits attractive.
Yeah.
So sometimes they can be extremely charming, smooth operators. And so, but the notion that it might be a strategy or even possibly an evolved strategy, it doesn't really say anything about whether it's sort of good or bad from a moral or ethical perspective. I mean, I think there are plenty, this is one of the interesting things. I'll just mention this point that in the field of psychology, people historically, they want to take all the bad stuff that humans do and attribute it to the environment or bad parenting or the bad culture or society or capitalism. And they don't want any of the bad stuff to be part of human nature. Yeah. Well, I think we have bad stuff that's part of our nature. We can design environments that inhibit it or prevent its expression and behavior. But that doesn't mean that this bad stuff, came from bad parents or bad cultures. And so I think that the more we understand the causes and nature of this evolved psychology and the causes of bad behavior, the more we'll be able to design environments to prevent its occurrence and prevent, in this particular case, sexual violence toward women.
I wholeheartedly agree with you on that point, because I think what it means to be human is the potential to do the worst things and the potential to do some really awesome things. And we want to inhibit the things that are, extremely harmful to our fellow humans and other organisms. But understand it so then we can, just like you're saying, develop environments where that's not encouraged or that's not promoted. So we can't do that if we're just always avoiding that, or we're avoiding one part of the answer. So I wholeheartedly agree with you.
Yeah, exactly. And avoiding it or misattributing the causes. So if you're, always looking to bad things bad parents do or bad cultures, you're never going to get at some of the true root causes of these. So, and that's, more and more as I wrote the book, the focus became more and more on preventing sexual violence toward women in its various forms, from sexual harassment through stalking to intimate partner violence and sexual coercion. Because I think that it is the most widespread human rights problem in the world.
I totally agree.
In the following sense, that there are lots of human rights problems in the world, but this is something that affects every ethnic group, every religious group, every culture around the globe. And so you have women as the primary victims of sexual violence, and then also what are called secondary victims, which I also talk about in the book, which are people who care about them, their brothers, their mothers, their sisters, their friends, and the women who have to live in fear, even if they don't literally become a victim of sexual violence, they have to live in fear of the possibility of becoming a victim of sexual violence. And so it's one of these, I think the most widespread human rights problem that we have in the world. And so more and more as I wrote the book, I wanted to try to identify the causal factors involved and the defenses against it, the things that can prevent sexual violence. Because I think we really need to grapple with this. And I'm very happy that, I didn't start out as an applied evolutionary psychologist, but I'm actually very delighted that this information can be used for very positive purposes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just before we finish here, it was just a few more points here. Did you at any point look at or discuss any of the adaptation or byproduct hypotheses and understanding this data and these points?
Yes, absolutely. Well, that's, when it comes to an evolutionary framework, those are really the two products of the evolutionary process, is adaptations and then byproducts of adaptations. And there's a very, within evolutionary psychology, a very heated debate, or at least there has been a heated debate about whether sexual coercion whether there are adaptations specifically for sexual coercion, that is for bypassing female choice, or is it a byproduct of other adaptations, such as the fact that men have this desire for short-term sex, they tend to be aroused by visual cues, they tend to use physical aggression to obtain a variety of things, from robbing banks to other things, and that would be more of a byproduct hypothesis. And what I conclude in the book is that there is not good evidence that there are rape-specific adaptations in humans. It's not to say that there couldn't be, or that future research might not discover them, but there currently is not. And I actually I summarize evidence that refutes one of the key rape adaptation hypotheses, which is what's called the mate deprivation hypothesis, which is basically loser males, is another way to put it. Guys who, like the incels, the guys who can't attract women through normal means, resort to rape. Well, it turns out that's actually not the case. That is, it tends to be guys who are more successful at mating, guys who are higher in status, guys who can get away with it. So we have, of course, modern examples like Harvey Weinstein, for example, Jeffrey Epstein, Bill Cosby. Guys who are actually in a position to get away with it tend to be those who are more likely to do it. And so the rape deprivation hypothesis does not appear to hold water, at least in its original simplified form.
Yeah. I have two final questions here. Just real briefly, I mean, we could spend another hour or so on this alone. I know there's a lot of research, and I'm sure you get into it in the book, but this idea of the intimate partner violence there's a lot there. There's a lot of things there. Is it true? I'm assuming that kind of in the first part of the book, where you start out laying just kind of the, for males and females, kind of what happens when they're in conflict, but that is it true that there's about 50-50 are perpetrators of intimate partner violence?
Well, that's a little bit, you have to be careful with that, because there are some studies where if you just look at the sheer frequency of acts, so he slapped her, she slapped him, there are studies that suggest that there's more of a gender equality on those things. But as you get more extreme, and this applies to the other things as well, the more men tend to have a monopoly on it. So, yes, it's true that men tend to underreport it. Men are embarrassed by it. So there was an interview with a guy who got clocked with a frying pan by his partner and called the police, and he's like bleeding from the head, and the police came, and the police said to the guy, look, if she so much as broke a fingernail in this altercation, you're the one that's going to get arrested, not her. And so some of those guys don't press charges and so forth. But nonetheless, it is the case that there are shelters for battered women. And in terms of the extreme forms of battering men, the more extreme you get, the more men tend to have monopoly on it.
No, that's helpful.
Counting up just like he slapped her, she slapped him is not an accurate reflection of that.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. I guess the last thing here is, you kind of mentioned it, is just kind of applied evolutionary psychology bit. I feel like some people will, there's definitely criticisms of evolutionary psychology, which, I've read those, I've heard those. I don't really think they hold a lot of weight, but that I'm biased. But how do you see, where the field of evolutionary psychology is going in the next 10, 15, 20 years? Is it more of this kind of applied stuff, or is it more still kind of in the lab and doing research, or a combination of both? Just kind of, where do you see the field going?
Yeah, great question. And I see it going in both directions. So in my own work, I've become more and more interested in applying it, because I think that if we can show, and I think that we will be able to show, that identifying the underlying evolved psychology of bad stuff and the circumstances in which it is either expressed or inhibited and that we can use that information to solve some social problems, I think that will give a lot of buy-in, that people will start to see, oh, this actually, it's a framework that has a lot of positive utility and we need to start embracing it. So, and that interests me in particular with respect to mating related stuff, and in particular sexual violence. However, I think that there's still a lot of gold to be discovered about human nature, getting back to that earlier discussion that we had, where there's been a lot of work on morality, on altruism, on cooperation, on coalitional psychology, on kin psychology. So there's a tremendous amount of basic research, basic things that have yet to be discovered about human nature. And that's very exciting. And so I mean, that's one of the joys of writing a textbook. My evolutionary psychology textbook is every 4 years I get to review what everyone else has been doing. And even though my own work focuses heavily on the mating side of things, I get to review what everyone else has been doing. And it's really gratifying to see how much progress is being made.
Yeah. I think of Joe Heinrich, and I think of there's a new book, Social Instinct by Nicola Raini, and there's so many people. Right, Michael McCullough wrote his book, Kindness of Strangers. Like, yeah, there's been a lot of stuff in the past 5 years, for sure. Just talking about kin stuff, cultural evolution, cooperation, more of the social aspect, coalition stuff, and so that is super cool that. You have this base that you've built, and you can just go back and read all the cool stuff everyone's doing and, kind of keep adding to it. So that's pretty awesome. Well, David, I mean, you've been so nice with your time. This was all so wonderful, all the information you've given. What do you want to tell listeners? Where can they find you? Where can they get your book? Where's the best place to get at you?
So, the new book comes out April 27th. So it's When Men Behave Badly, The Hidden Roots of Sexual Deception, Harassment, and Assault. And so that's out April 27th. It'll be available, at all the, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all the online and in-person bookstores, which are fortunately now starting to open up again.
Yeah,
really great.
Yeah, this is very nice. Yeah.
But my work, so I also have links to all of my books and all of my research articles on my website. And that's simply my name, davidbuss.com. So if people go to davidbuss.com, they can basically gain access to all my work.
Okay. No, that's great. Well, David, I mean, many thanks. This was really a blast, and I enjoyed it, and I could keep talking to you for hours and hours, but I'm so thankful for your time and energy and all the wonderful work you've done. It's really, really wonderful.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me on. It's been a real delight to talk with you, and thank you for this interesting conversation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I learned a lot. It was very, very fascinating. So I can't wait to read the book and everything. So thank you so much.
Okay, cool.
All right, thanks.